The Beverly Hills Hotel, 1956. The Polo Lounge was half empty that Tuesday afternoon when Marilyn Monroe walked in for what she'd been told would be a casual conversation about her upcoming film. Hedda Hopper was already seated, notebook open, pen poised like a weapon she hadn't yet decided to use. The Columnist had been working Hollywood for 20 years, long enough to know that interviews weren't really about movies. They were about control, about who left the room diminished and who left untouched. These are the stories they never wanted told, the moments that stayed behind closed doors. If you're here for the usual Hollywood fantasy, this isn't it. Subscribe to see what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling. Marilyn had taken the meeting because her publicist insisted. Hopper's column reached 12 million readers. She could end careers with a single paragraph or resurrect them with carefully chosen praise. The studio wanted good coverage for Bus Stop, and Marilyn had learned that sometimes you showed up to things you didn't want to attend. That was part of the job, even when you sensed the danger before you sat down. The columnist didn't stand when Marilyn approached. She gestured to the chair across from her with the kind of casual authority that came from knowing everyone wanted something from you. Marilyn settled into her seat, ordered tea she wouldn't drink, and waited. She'd done enough of these to know the rhythm. The first few minutes would be warm, almost friendly. Then would come the shift. Hopper started with the film, asked about working with Don Murray, commented on the costumes. Her voice had that practiced cheerfulness that never quite reached her eyes. Marilyn answered carefully. The way you walked across ice you weren't sure would hold. She mentioned her acting coach, her preparation, the challenge of the role. Everything sounded pleasant enough. Everything felt wrong. Then Hopper leaned back, folded her hands, and smiled. You know, Marilyn, a lot of people are curious about something. The shift had come. Here you are, talking about Stanislavski and method acting, taking yourself so seriously. She paused, let the words settle. But we all remember where you came from. The foster homes, the factory work, the calendar. Another pause. Do you really think all this studying makes you something you're not? The question landed exactly as intended. It wasn't even phrased as an insult, which made it worse. It sounded like concern, like an older woman trying to save a younger one from embarrassment. But everyone in Hollywood knew what Hopper was really asking. Who do you think you are? The room didn't go quiet. There was still the distant clatter of dishes, the murmur of other conversations, but something contracted around their table. Marilyn felt it in her chest first, that old familiar tightness, the instinct to apologize, to laugh it off, to make herself smaller so the moment would pass. She'd spent years learning to do that, to smooth over discomfort by absorbing it herself. But she'd also spent the last year studying with Lee Strasberg, reading books that bored her until they didn't, showing up to class even when the other students made it clear they thought she was a joke. She looked at her tea. Steam rose from the cup in a thin, twisting line. She thought about the last foster home, the one where they'd made her sleep on the back porch because they didn't want her in the house. She thought about the photographer who'd paid her $50 for the calendar shoot and told her nobody would care about her face anyway. She thought about every casting director who'd assumed she couldn't read. Then she thought about something else. She thought about the last scene she'd filmed for Bus Stop, the moment when her character finally stops performing and lets herself be seen. She thought about how terrified she'd been to play it that way, without the armor of breathiness and curves. She thought about how it had felt when Logan called cut and just nodded, once, like she'd finally understood something important. Marilyn lifted her gaze to Hopper. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made the columnist's pen stop moving. You're right, she said. I came from nothing. I was nobody. Maybe that's exactly why I understand what it means to want to be better than you were yesterday. She paused, and the pause had purpose. But here's what I've learned, Miss Hopper. The people who need to remind others where they came from are usually the ones most afraid of being reminded where they came from themselves. She let that sit for a moment. We all started somewhere. Some of us just aren't ashamed to admit we're still learning. The columnist's face did something complicated. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was some of that. It was the look of someone who'd reached for a weapon they always kept close and found it wasn't where they'd left it. Hopper had built her career on knowing which questions would break people, and this question should have worked. It had worked on others. It should have made Marilyn defensive, apologetic, small. Instead, Marilyn had taken the cruelty and turned it into something else. Not a counterattack. That would have given Hopper ammunition for her column. Not a breakdown. That would have confirmed everything the columnist wanted to believe. She'd simply refused to accept the premise of the question. She'd made it clear that shame was a choice, and she wasn't choosing it. Hopper tried to recover. She asked another question, something about Marilyn's marriage to Arthur Miller, but her voice had changed. The authority was still there, but the certainty wasn't. She'd lost control of the interview without anyone raising their voice, without a single dramatic moment. That was the part that would bother her later, when she was alone in her office trying to figure out what had happened. Marilyn finished the interview because walking out would have been giving in to what Hopper wanted. She answered the remaining questions with the same measured calm, never defensive, never overly warm. When it was over, she thanked the columnist, stood, and left the way she'd arrived, with her head up and her expression unreadable. Behind her, Hopper sat with her notebook, staring at words she wasn't sure how to use. The column that ran the following week was different than what Hopper usually wrote about Marilyn. It talked about bus stop. It mentioned her dedication to craft. It didn't use the phrase just a blonde or make jokes about her intelligence. It wasn't warm exactly. Hopper wasn't capable of that, but it wasn't cruel either. It was careful. That was new. What Hopper didn't write about was the interview itself. She didn't describe how Marilyn had responded to the question about her past. She didn't try to recreate that moment when the power in the room had shifted. Some things couldn't be turned into copy, not without admitting you'd been the one left without words. So she wrote a review that was professional and moved on to other subjects. In the weeks that followed, the story of that interview made its way through Hollywood's invisible network. Someone at a nearby table had overheard part of it. A waiter mentioned it to another waiter. Publicists heard versions from their clients who'd heard it from friends. The details changed with each retelling, but the core remained. Marilyn Monroe had walked into a Hedda Hopper interview and walked out with her dignity intact. That mattered in ways that were hard to measure. It wasn't about the column or what Hopper had written. It was about what people saw when they looked at Marilyn after that. Directors started to understand that maybe she wasn't just showing up to set unprepared and difficult. Maybe there was something else happening, something harder to see but just as real. The whispers about her being difficult didn't stop, but they got quieter. Joshua Logan, her director on Bus Stop, heard about the interview from someone at Fox. He didn't bring it up with Marilyn directly, but the next time they worked together on a scene, he gave her a note about playing anger and then stopped himself. "You already know this," he said. She nodded once. He never treated her like she needed protecting after that. He treated her like someone who could handle what came. Arthur Miller heard the story from Marilyn herself, weeks later, when she mentioned it in passing. He'd asked how the Hopper interview had gone, and she'd shrugged and said it was fine. Then she'd added, almost as an afterthought, what the columnist had asked. Miller had stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "What did you say back?" She'd told him. He'd been quiet for a long time. "Good," he'd finally said, "just that." Marilyn herself didn't think about the interview much after it happened. She had a film to finish, lines to learn, scenes that terrified her for reasons that had nothing to do with Hedda Hopper. But sometimes, late at night, when she couldn't sleep and found herself thinking about all the ways people had tried to make her feel small, she'd remember that afternoon. She'd remember choosing not to shrink. There was no dramatic fallout. Hopper didn't become an ally or a friend. She didn't write glowing profiles or defend Marilyn from other critics. But she also never used that particular weapon again, never went after Marilyn's past as proof that she didn't belong. That was its own kind of victory, though not one anyone would write about or celebrate. It was just a line that, once crossed, couldn't be crossed again. Years later, when people talked about Marilyn, they often focused on her fragility, her struggles, the way Hollywood broke her down. They talked about the men who controlled her career, the studios that used her, the public that couldn't see past the image. All of that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. It left out the moments when she refused to break, when she stood her ground without making a scene. The Polo Lounge interview was one of those moments. It didn't make headlines. It didn't change her career overnight. It didn't solve the larger problems of how women were treated in Hollywood, or how the press felt entitled to cruelty disguised as honesty. But it proved something that Marilyn needed to prove, maybe more to herself than to anyone else. That she could face contempt and not collapse. That dignity was a choice she could make. Hedda Hopper died in 1966, 4 years after Marilyn. By then, the columnist's power had already faded. Television had changed everything, and her kind of writing felt like it belonged to a different era. When people remembered her, they remembered the feuds, the rivalries, the cruelty she'd wielded like it was part of the job. They didn't remember the interview where she'd been left without her usual weapons. But some people did remember. The ones who'd been there, who'd heard about it, who'd understood what it meant. They remembered that on a Tuesday afternoon in 1956, a woman who wasn't supposed to be smart or strong had shown both qualities without ever raising her voice. They remembered because it was rare. Not because Marilyn was the only person capable of it, but because Hollywood so rarely allowed women that kind of moment. The Beverly Hills Hotel is still there. The Polo Lounge still serves tea to people conducting business that's never quite what it seems. The booth where Marilyn and Hopper sat has been occupied by thousands of other conversations, other interviews, other moments of tension disguised as civility. None of them know about the afternoon when a woman refused to be ashamed of where she came from and, in doing so, changed what people thought she was capable of. History remembers Marilyn Monroe as many things: tragic, beautiful, lost, exploited. All of those words carry truth, but they don't carry everything. They don't carry the afternoons when she sat across from people who wanted to diminish her and chose quietly and without drama not to allow it. Those moments didn't fit the narrative people wanted. They were too complicated, too quiet, too easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. But they happened, in rooms that smelled like expensive perfume and old money, in conversations that looked polite from a distance, in the space between a cruel question and a measured response. They happened and they mattered, even if nobody wrote them down the way they should have been written, even if the only people who really understood were the ones who'd learned that sometimes strength looks nothing like people expect it to. The interview was over in 40 minutes. The column ran and was forgotten within days. Hedda Hopper moved on to other targets, other subjects, other ways of exercising power. Marilyn finished Bus Stop and moved on to other films, other challenges, other moments when she'd have to decide how much of herself to defend and how much to let go. The world kept turning. Hollywood kept producing stars and destroying them with equal efficiency. But something had shifted that afternoon in the Polo Lounge. It was small. It was private. It wouldn't save Marilyn from the things that would eventually break her down. But it proved that before the breaking, there had been moments of holding on. Moments when she'd looked cruelty in the face and refused to flinch. Moments when she'd understood that the past could be used against you only if you agreed to be ashamed of it. This is what they don't teach you about Hollywood. Real power isn't loud. It's the ability to stay whole when someone tries to tear you down with a smile. Subscribe to hear more stories about the moments that defined the people we thought we knew. The moments that happened when nobody was keeping score.